There's a lot of different functions that come into play here, but we can break it down into sensation, integration, and response. So sensation is the sensory division of the nervous system. And your sensory receptors use the nervous system in order to send information to the brain. So you can see here that there is a sensory receptor feeling hot or cold in the hand or in the skin of the hand. And that information gets sent along the nervous system to the brain. In the brain, integration occurs. So integration it primarily occurs in the brain. It can also occur in the spinal cord, but the brain's almost always involved. And integration is where that sensory information is processed. So the brain processes kind of what all is going on and gives you the conscious perception of something being hot or cold or rough or painful or something like that. And then if needed, the brain can send a respond out to something in order to do something to respond to the original sensory stimulus. So here, in this example where maybe someone feels that the water is too cold or something, it can send that information to the hand, or I'm sorry, in this example it would actually be if the water was too hot, the brain would send a signal to the hand and trigger the muscles in the hand so that the hand can be pulled away from the hot water so that the person wouldn't get burnt. All right, so the sensory division sends information to the brain. The brain integrates that information and processes it, and then it sends information through what we call the motor division in order to elicit a response. So some different things that can trigger sensory receptors are things like taste, smell, touch, sight, hearing, oh, I've got touch on there twice, and stretch. So we'll talk more about the sensory systems in the next module. But these are all things that have specialized nervous system structures that allow them to communicate with the brain. And what these sensory receptors are detecting are changes, which we call stimuli in the environment. And these stimuli may be internal or external. So for example, feeling that the water is hot would be an external sensation, whereas having a stomach ache would be an internal sensation. Integration happens in the brain, and it processes that sensory information. It might take sensory information from multiple sources. So maybe when someone puts their hand underneath the faucet, the brain can detect that it's wet and too hot and make adjustments accordingly if needed. And as I mentioned, it occurs in the central nervous system, usually in the brain, but it can also occur in the spinal cord. And then the response is responding to the original stimulus. So the brain can send a signal to something in order to respond. Now, the response can happen through the somatic nervous system or the autonomic nervous system. And the key differences between the two are whether the response is voluntary or involuntary. So voluntary just means that it can be consciously controlled. So think about your skeletal muscle. If you think about flexing your arm, you can make your arm flex. You can make those muscles bend and do that voluntarily. In the autonomic nervous system, something would happen involuntarily. So for example, if you burned your hand, your body would maybe react by increasing blood flow to your muscles so that you can move quickly away from the hot water. And in doing so, it would maybe trigger the cardiac muscle to increase its contraction speed in order to get that blood to the hand faster. So the autonomic nervous system is primarily involved in maintaining homeostasis. It can speed up or slow down your heart rate, which can affect your blood pressure. It can stimulate your smooth muscles, so it can change the size of the pupil of your eye. It can increase or decrease the function of your digestive system, and other places where smooth muscle is found. Glands, so it can trigger an endocrine gland to release a hormone, or trigger a sweat gland to release sweat, or something like that. So 2 main divisions, you've got somatic, which is voluntary, and the brain activates skeletal muscle. And you have autonomic, which is involuntary, and it activates cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Now, in some cases, skeletal muscle does contract involuntarily, and that typically happens as a reflex. So, for example, typically if you are burning your hand under hot water or on the stove, your brain is going to actually have you move your hand away from the heat source before you even consciously perceive that you're burning your hand. But technically that response could be overridden by voluntarily keeping your hand under the hot water or on the hot stove. Not that you would want to, but you could. So if we take an overall look at the organization of the nervous system, so first of all, we've got 2 different structural divisions. So we've got our central nervous system, which includes the brain and spinal cord. And the spinal cord is the connector between the brain and the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is made up of neurons. There are sensory neurons that originate in sensory organs such as the eye, the tongue, the ear, the skin, and it sends signals to the brain through nerves through the spinal cord to the brain. And then when the brain responds, the brain sends that information through the spinal cord through motor neurons. And these motor neurons are either going to activate our somatic nervous system, which is our voluntarily controlled skeletal muscle, or the autonomic nervous system, which is the involuntary response of cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. And we're not going to talk a lot about sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions in this module, but in our next module we will, because we can further break down the autonomic response into the fight or flight division, which is the sympathetic division, or the rest or digest system, which is also known as the parasympathetic